Hey, Scott here from whattype.com, and in this video I'm posting an excerpt of a full-length podcast that I did about social skills and social dynamics with my friends Micah Electric and Jake Payton. So for all three of us, we went through a dramatic transformation from being, very shy and awkward as kids to feeling comfortable in social situations, and in Jake's case, even being an expert on relationships and social dynamics. So I thought it'd be fun to share some awkward childhood photos. So this is a photo of Micah as a kid. This is me as a kid, and this is Jake as a kid. Truth be told, actually, Jake is in the process of moving right now, so he couldn't provide a photo, so I just came up with the next best thing. It seems like probably a good representation of what he might have looked like as a kid. So anyhow, back to the video. I divided this segment into 4 basic sections. So in the beginning, we talk about the challenges and the opportunities for our particular types, INFJ and INTJ. And on some level, everything I say here will apply to introverts in general. I talk a little bit about how it's different for introverts and for extroverts. Now, by the way, if you are not clear on your type, if you don't know what your type is for sure, but you're interested in Myers-briggs, you can go to whattype.com/mytype to find out how you can get definitive clarity on your type once and for all. So the second part of the video here is about taking control of our responses to the things that happen to us and taking control of the decisions that we make in these scenarios so that we can generate new options and change our results. We tend to have go-to responses to different things that might trigger us, and a key part of changing our results and, socially and in our interpersonal reactions is learning how to respond differently to things that might trigger us. This is a key for transformation. In changing how we respond to stimulus, to things that trigger us, it generates new options, and that gives us the opportunity to transform. So the third section here is about overcoming fear. So we talk a little bit about how we have different approaches to this, to dealing with fear. And some of this is based on type, and some of this is just, general things that we've learned as, wise elders in our ripe old ages here, about how to overcome fear, like how to actually do it, because when I was younger, in many ways, I was very much ruled by fear, and I found ways to break out of that. I think, us did. So that's what we talk about in that section. And then in the fourth section, we talk about breaking through the psychological barriers to actually develop social skills and how we went about doing that. So I hope you find this video useful. One other thing I should mention, as I mentioned, Jake is an expert on social dynamics. If you want to check out his stuff, you want to check out his social media, his YouTube, go to whattype.com/Jake. So without further ado, here is the segment from our podcast. Myers-briggs types. So for anyone new, there are 16 different Myers-briggs types. And INTJs and INFJs are, most people think, the most rare of the 16 types. And challenges that these two types have, challenges and opportunities, because all Myers-briggs types have a certain set of challenges and opportunities. And if you see it from a certain perspective, none is better than any other. It's just that we're wired to do things really well, and then by virtue of that, we have our challenges. So our types, INTJ and INFJ, we tend to be problem solvers. When we're at our best, what our brain does is it takes things that we've internalized, pieces of data, and it sort of shifts it around, shifts these pieces around unconsciously in our minds in order to produce insights, to see patterns, and often, to predict what's going to happen in the future and things like that. Now, when we use that process, our brain sort of snaps back to that process all the time. And it's like our brain's operating system. It's like sort of like water to a fish. Now, part of the challenge socially with that inclination is that we are not as naturally in tuned to what's happening in tangible reality, sort of outside of ourselves. We tend to, when we're using this function, which we do habitually, we're detached from the outside world and we're kind of in our heads. So we can be sort of late bloomers socially, but we can also, over time learn social skills and in some cases surpass people who have more of a natural inclination to towards social intelligence in some areas if we really sort of like make a study out of it, like Jake. um Jake has I think really mastered a lot in the social arts, and gets paid good money to do things like relationship coaching, getting people out of the doghouse, things like that, because Jake understands how social interactions fundamentally work. Like, so INTJs have very strategic brains, generally speaking. So I'll give you a quick difference between our types. So, and these create their own sort of set of challenges, and we can get into that a little bit. But like, so INFJs, we have that same sort of being in our head inclination. We're also very empathetic. And being that the in our head part is actually where we spend more of our time, the empathetic element to it can actually be a challenge, because despite the fact that sort of empathy and an awareness of emotional undercurrents in things can be beneficial socially, we can have a rough go at it sometimes when, like, because we have like this awareness of this like sort of tension and harmony, and we want things to be harmonious, but it takes time to sort of develop that skill. So as a counterexample, an ENFJ, the sort of extroverted version of my type, they are naturally attuned to the outside world and emotional undercurrents and all that. So they tend to pick up on you. They tend to have or develop social skills and social intelligence quicker. Whereas an INFJ, like for us, we can go through painfully awkward stages trying to figure out how to turn that empathetic element into a strength and learn skills and sort of learn how to get out of our heads and whatnot. For INTJs don't have that same sort of empathetic component in the same way. I mean, any functioning, human being who's not a sociopath has empathy, but, INTJs tend to have a little bit more of a buffer there. So for an INFJ, we can't get away from it. It's like a friend of mine put it this way. It's like having a second nervous system on the outside of your skin. Like, you can't, if someone is like hurt, in the room, like, we can't not be affected by that. And we have a lower tolerance by nature for tension. We can develop that. We can learn to hold tension and to have difficult conversations and things as we develop, but it's something that can be a challenge for us developmentally. But like INTJs, being naturally very good strategists, this is something that can be applied to the world of social skills. So it just, usually takes a little bit of time and self-development to sort of reach the potential there. Both of our types are good at sort of getting into the perspectives of other people. INFJs will tend to, get into more of like, what is this person feeling? Whereas like INTJs can be very good at getting into people's thought processes. So INTJs can be actually very good at understanding and analyzing things that matter socially. But we usually don't, come out of the gate that way. So anyhow, that's how I would preface this with, what the sort of the challenges and opportunities are for our types. So
I mean, you have said to me, sorry to interject 1 second here, but you have said to me on a couple of occasions that INTJs are all about efficiency
yes.
and getting to the point quicker. And yet you're also saying that we're in our heads and that we need a little bit of analytical time and then we can dive in. I have seen both of that, and I agree with you on all of that. I think one of the things that from what you're saying right now about the INTJ difference is, and I'm just bottom lining it because I like to be efficient, is the fact that you're going to analyze it longer, and you might, from what I've seen at least, have a harder time applying the conclusions that you come up with to the real world because you're also thinking of the feeling part of it with a lot more depth than Jake or I will. We're more about the bottom line. It's like if you know A, B, and C, then you know D is next. You'll be like, well, if you know A, B, and C, then D might be next, but somebody might want to skip D and go right to E. And I go, I don't really give a shit. D is next. That's what it is.
Yeah, a great example of an INTJ who is on the extreme. I just finished the Walter Isaacson biography on Elon Musk, and Elon Musk has Asperger's. So INTJs by nature are yeah, they're like shit gets done first, and people's feelings come next.
That's right.
Elon Musk is that to the extreme, um, and yes, yeah, I think that's
I mean, that's the difference I've seen in you and I when we're navigating the social dynamics of any room, is that you're very aware, much more aware of people's possible issues with certain things that are going on or their feelings or whatever. And I'm more about, let's get to the bottom of the point of this conversation. And I know for sure Jake is that way even more than I am. So it's very interesting how we navigate those different dynamics. But yeah, I mean, your feelings are your responsibility. That's a great video by Kyle Cease. I'll promote him. I love him.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
And
I
when
think
that
he's great
video
too.
came out, that explained so much of how I feel to other people who disagreed with that concept inherently. And I was just like, see, I'm not the only one who's saying this. Like actual psychologists and
Yeah,
life coaches and those kind of people have been saying this for years. And people want to shrug off responsibility for the way that they feel as if the person who triggered it is the actual person causing the issue. There's also one called nonviolent communication. One of the main points in that entire video series is that there's a trigger for your feelings, and then there's your actual feelings. And the feelings that you feel and continue to feel are because of the way that you think of yourself and the world and your place in it, not because of the trigger. Stop blaming
right. And if
your
you
ex
don't
or anybody else.
separate those two, then you are just an automaton who is just,
Then you
moving in lockstep with the stimulus in your environment without being able to separate and then recognize this is how I feel from, that. And from there, if we're aware of this, we have choices about how we respond to it. Because if we're speaking from the language of you made me do this thing,
right.
that's all, I mean, this is all basic like hypnosis, sort of thinking,
Yeah.
that's how, that's the power of suggestion. If you speak like that, you think like that, and therefore you are at cause and not at effect.
Well, you're a victim. It's a victim perspective, and a lot of people go right to it because it's an easy out.
Can I
Yeah.
jump in for a second?
So Jake, do you have any,
Can I jump in for a second?
yeah,
Can you
yeah,
hear me?
Yeah, jump in, of course.
yes.
Yeah, so for me, I before I was aware that I had a choice what my emotions were causing, I was just there'd be an emotion and there'd be an effect, and I felt like I had no choice what I was doing. And through some mentorship, I had a mentor specifically tell me, he was like, whoa, 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 you stop, you get to stop and you get to choose whether or not you want to feel that emotion when it comes into you. Right. And you don't get to choose what you feel in the first place, but once you have that emotion, you get to stop and you get to decide, okay, is this rational or is this whatever? And in that way, I was able to kind of install almost software into myself to start having those emotional tools that I needed. And that also applies to empathy. So for me, I started finding answers through being empathetic. So empathy for me was almost a tool towards a solution that later ended in me actually having empathy more than I ever would have had I not found a solution
That's
there.
how they, yeah, that's how they get
Huh?
you.
Yeah, I agree.
Sell you on that empathy, and next thing you know, you end up at empathy, and it's actually
I
a
mean, it's
good
an
thing.
interesting transition from baby to child to teen to adult, because like so much of those instances are you having a feeling and then having the natural reaction to it. And the natural reaction is whatever it is in the beginning when you're a baby, perhaps. But that, I think it gets shaped extremely quickly by the type of reaction that your parents have to it too. One kid falls off of a swing and a parent is hysterical, crying and going nuts and running to the hospital immediately. And another one goes, oh, get up, you're fine, don't worry about it. And the kid's smiling and back on the swing in like 30 seconds because of the different kind of reaction that the parents had. I was actually on a hike with my sister recently, and we actually saw this in real life, where a kid fell off a rock that he was climbing, and the mom had hysterical reaction at first, but saw my sister's reaction being super calm and smiling at the boy and cheering him on. And he got up and he cried for literally 10 seconds and stopped crying because she was not reacting in a negative way. So I think when that happens again and again to kids, they get trained to having a certain reaction to their feelings. And when they're scared or whatever, that kind of thing happens, their reaction gets reinforced by the parent who's also scared. But if you have a parent who's calm and who's smiling at you, saying you're okay, and whatever kind of like encouraging things, I think you can get past it very quickly. Obviously, we don't have much control of that when we're kids, but as Jake said, there's a certain point where you realize you do have some control over it. You're going to have that instant triggered feeling, sure, but how you react to it is definitely a choice at a certain point in your maturity and your growth.
I have a 2-year-old daughter, and I can see her look to me to figure out how she's supposed to feel when something like that happens quite often. So that's absolutely true.
Yeah.
Yeah. And this comes into play in social situations. Totally. I want to tell a quick story and then on the topic, and then we can get into some more of the social stuff. So this was a profound insight for me on recognizing that I had a choice in situations where I didn't consciously realize that I did. So I went to a seminar by a guy named Eben Pagan, and I was so juiced up after the seminar. I was like, I got to do something in tangible reality to prove that something has changed in my life. I need a symbolic sort of victory. So I was like, what am I going to do? And I thought of Six Flags. They have a ride there. So I was afraid of heights. They have a ride there called the Superman ride, which goes way straight up and then way back down. And I was like, oh yeah, I would never go on that. Therefore I must. So I recruited a friend of mine who was at the seminar. I was all juiced up. I'm like, I'm going to do this thing and I'll conquer the Superman ride. And then I'm going to feel invincible. And he was all in, and he offered to drive. So we drive up there. We get to the parking lot. The Superman ride is right there at the parking lot. And I'll never forget, I looked up at that thing. And I was like, I knew in the deepest part of my soul, I was like, I am never getting on that. I had this horrible feeling. I was like, no, it's not going to happen. And I couldn't.
I would have a totally different reaction. But go on.
But I couldn't tell him in that moment, like right when we drove there after I, pumped the whole thing up, like, oh yeah, sorry, bro, that's not happening. We just came for nothing, whatever. So I was like, I'm trying to figure out what to like, trying to buy myself time. I'm like, all right, I need to go on like the sissiest rides first and work my way up. So we literally went on like the kiddie roller coasters, and I'm like white knuckling it on this thing. I'm like, when's the last time they inspected this thing? And I'm buying time, and I'm like, let's go do some water rides for fun, whatever. And I'm like trying to figure out what I'm gonna say. And then he's like, come on, let's get back on. Let's do some roller coasters. Let's work your way up, whatever. I'm like, all right. So I start going to these roller coasters, and I had a moment where I realized, my natural reaction on all these roller coasters was to clamp down and just be in this sort of state of fear. And it just occurred to me like, okay, I've committed to this thing. I'm strapped on this thing. I'm not getting off of it. What if I decided to approach this differently? What if I adopted it? What if I was just like, well, I'm on this ride and whatever that happens, and I'm just going to let go and ride the ride. So I started to have these moments where I was like, ooh, okay. And then I go back into it for a minute, and then, so on and so forth. And then eventually it got fun. And then we went to, they have the new X2 roller coaster, which goes backwards 1,000,000 miles up in the air. And then, you come flying down, it shoots fire at you and plays Metallica and all this stuff, whatever. And got off that ride and I was like, hell yeah. I was like, let's go on the Superman ride right now. We went to, get directions to it. And then the woman was like, oh, we're sorry, the park is closed. And I was like, oh. So anyhow, I ended up going back there on my birthday a while later and actually went on it. And it was dope. I absolutely loved it. And had there not been a really long line there, I would have gone on that ride all day. But I tell you what, the big lesson was that there was every part of my instincts, my intuition, my everything told me it was impossible, that there was no way that I was going to get on that ride. And then I did, and it was dope. And that goes to, you think of all the things you might be able to extrapolate that to, the things that we don't think are, necessarily possible, when we get out there, get a little bit of exposure therapy. This kind of plays into the social thing too, because that was certainly a big part of my, developing some social skills was exposure therapy and getting out there and over time your internal feelings about these things change as you actually do things.
It's so interesting to me listening to this story because it's so completely unrelatable to the way that I would think in that situation. And I'm not saying it's right or wrong. I'm not judging it. I'm just trying to relate to it.
Right. This is the thing, by the way, about I've had a similar conversation with my dad, and it's very interesting. This is an interesting insight from Myers-briggs. Because of the way that our brains are wired differently, we don't recognize, unless we've really internalized these sort of models, how people's wiring is different. And this is why oftentimes other people's behavior will seem stupid to us or irrational or however we label it, because we don't recognize that they're using a different process that is, is valid in a different way, because it's just our brains are using that wiring. We unconsciously sort of project our processes onto other people. Anyhow, sorry.
But I mean, what's interesting to me is that whenever I approach something that seems a little scary or foreboding, my brain, maybe it's just my soothing mechanism, I don't know, or rationalization or whatever. I think it's with everything though. My brain goes to what's the probability? And the probability of crashing is like, it's infinitesimally small. I'm watching it work like 100 times before I even go on it. It works every single day that way, 100 times a day. So the probability is almost infinitesimally small that anything bad is going to happen. So of course I'm going to go on it. Who cares? The only thing that I would be more concerned about is what's the probability of me throwing up, because that probability is a lot higher. So I know what I need to worry about, but that's not the probability of crashing. But as you were talking, and I was having such a hard time relating to it with this kind of example, I was going back to our hike and what instigated this conversation to begin with, which was a conversation about how I've become really confident and I can push through the fear in almost every area of my life. And still, on occasion, there is that pullback.
Oh, that's right. Now I remember. Yeah.
Of when I'm approaching a girl that I find is actually really attractive, there's still this tiny bit of pullback that reminds me of the pullback I was feeling the first time I jumped out of a plane. And it's just like, no, you don't want to do that. Pull back. Right. And when I think about it, and I think of my answer that I'm giving you right now about the probability of surviving that roller coaster being so high, right? And the probability of surviving that interaction with the girl being so high, and the fact that it's probably not going to go nearly as bad as my worst case scenario in my mind. And yet still, every once in a while, not often, but once in a while, there is that pullback in the social realm that, for me at least, doesn't exist pretty much in any other area of my life.
Yeah, if only we knew someone who understood a thing or two about that. I don't know.
Ding!
Get a different guy.
Yeah, Jay, I don't know, Jake, do you want to comment on that at all?
I mean, I had a lot of that pullback. Like, so back to the roller coaster, I'm not like either one of you guys. I'm like, jump. I'm like, yeah, I'll do it.
He jumps off roller coasters.
And then if it sucks, I'm like,
you're not supposed to jump.
Getting used to, this is going to take some getting used to. So like, I wouldn't take that jump that Mike is speaking about, talking with girls. And then I wanted it so badly just to change my life. I just made a decision. This just stops now. All this shit I'm dealing with in my life stops now. And then when I first did that, the walk up, I like had fists clench at my sides, like shaking, physically shaking. And I went and did it anyway. So I'm the type to just do it and then deal with the terribleness later, you know?
Yeah, that
But I think
approach
that
has
comes
actually
from a
been very
deep-seated
helpful to me, which I'll comment on after you're done.
I think that comes from a deep-seated. I've always been, what do you call it? I've always been brain capable, you know, and I've always known that I was really brain capable. So I've always had a lot of trust in myself and my, you know, I can think my way through it.
Mhm.
I've always had that deep-seated, you know, I was never socially verified for that, but I was always, you know, pretty confident in myself intellectually.
Mhm. Yeah,
You got visitors, Mike?
for me, hi.
All good, all good.
So, for me, a big part of my social development was exposure therapy, and it was recognizing, I mean, it was not long ago, we can talk a bit about our backgrounds, but I really had no social skills, to speak of. I mean, I remember like the first day of kindergarten, like being absolutely terrified. I was like, "Is all these people?" I had no idea like what to in like literally like formations of people like in groups were like gave me like a feeling of like terror, like like I had like real like social phobias, and a lot of there are a lot of different elements that sort of went into me sort of breaking out of that, but a big part of it was recognizing that like you said, you just do it, and if you don't attach a profound identity meaning to failure if it doesn't go well, and you reframe it into a success, like you just you can start any interaction from the frame of, you know what, I'm terrified of this, but I'm going to be proud of myself for having done it no matter what the results are. There's a performance coach who said that about going into a performance. You say that to yourself before you do it, and you're putting yourself in the right frame of mind so that you're just going to frame everything positively, and can likely also just help the interaction sort of go better, starting from there. But I learned that through cognitive behavioral therapy, and different you know Myers-briggs, like when I because once I learned I could tell what types people were, I sort of ended up like through some serendipitous interactions realizing like, whoa, I could do this as a pretty neat parlor trick, and people seem to like it, and I was very, because Myers-Briggs helped me to relate to people and relate to my family. It was a big source of pain for me. I became very motivated to want to develop this skill. And so I would do it. I really developed it, the multi-pronged approach, but a big part of it was doing it as a parlor trick in bars. And in when if I would have an intuition about a person's type, I just might be sitting there in the bar, and I hear someone say something. I'm like, oh, I'm like, that guy's an ESTJ. I know it. I would have to start a conversation with them, and of course, like starting, you can imagine, there was a lot of awkwardness to work to figure out how to make this whole thing smooth, and whatever. But it was that important to me. It was that valuable to me that I would make that leap. And, I'd start a lot of conversations with, I know this is a weird question, but, whatever it took. And eventually I got a lot more smooth with it, but it was the exposure therapy of realizing that if something doesn't, and also sort of detachment from the ego. The book The Untethered Soul was very helpful for me. plant medicine has been very helpful. There are many different things that can help you sort of detach from you, because our ego wants to protect us from it. It operates under the premise that we're sort of separate from the outside world and we need to be protected. And then, social interactions, you can interpret bad social interactions as though there's something wrong with you. That's what I always used to do. So that's why it was so difficult. But once I broke through that barrier and realized if I fall flat on my face on a social interaction, which I've done many times now, I've got lots of reps there, and I'm still alive, and then you actually develop some of the skills, and it happens less and less, and you learn to you actually learn to develop your process for me anyway, by taking certain risks. Once I realized that if it went badly, it didn't mean I was this irredeemable idiot, then it gave me permission to experiment, where okay, I would do things, always like for the purpose of seeing what would happen. Because I would honestly start, social interactions saying different things where it's I don't know where this is going to go. Or sometimes I do things that are counterintuitive to be all right, I'm gonna have to figure out how to navigate my way out after I say this particular thing. And then you just sort of get in the reps, and it just becomes much easier once you start to detach from that meaning.
Yeah. If you detach from outcome in anything, it becomes a lot easier. I agree. And actually, regarding this subject specifically, not that I can remember, I didn't have this mentality until I met Jake and his buddy who introduced me, Brad P. And they're the ones that introduced me to this world of, it doesn't have to mean so much. It doesn't have to be taken so seriously. It can be played with. You're a smart guy, figure out a way to make it fun, detach from that outcome, try the different social cues, try the different social dynamics, just as an experiment. Even if it's going to yield a total shit outcome, it doesn't matter, because you're right. The only way that you're going to get comfortable with any of that process is by doing it again and again and gleaning some lesson from it each time. It's a very different application of the way that I think to this kind of thing than compared to what your initial story was, which was about overcoming a fear to go on a roller coaster. That's a totally different process for me. And that's what's been a little bit difficult sometimes to kind of transfer over, is that I definitely mastered it in some areas of my life and definitely did not master it in other areas of my life. Even when I thought maybe I had made huge amounts of progress, every once in a while, it'll just sneak up and come and bite me in the butt.
I find it's valuable to know, with the roller coaster lesson, that so say this, for example, the nut that you want to crack here, when it comes to approaching women who are particularly attractive, I find it psychologically helpful to know in any situation, just have that as a reference point, that even if it feels impossible, that it's not,
And so that the ramifications are not going to be that you die. Your ramifications in your mind on that roller coaster.
Except the roller coaster, you might.
Well, that's fine. But
that was my thinking when
I get it. Well, you said yourself, I get on the roller coaster and think, when's the last time this was inspected? Never in my life have I thought that, because I think they're running it the way that they have to run it. And that's why they never have accidents. But sure, they do occasionally, and you occasionally hear of it, whatever. But the bottom line.
My mind will go to what is the worst possible death that could happen on this roller coaster.
Right. In terms of applying that to what type and how that can be an advantage for you, I think it's really important to note that when you're in a social setting, all of these kinds of all this knowledge about how the different brains work can work in your favor if you have that knowledge, if you have the ability to understand that everybody in the room is not thinking the way that you are, and that they're thinking in these other ways. That knowledge can be of great advantage, especially you put it as your biggest challenge was your family. And at a certain point, you realized that the way that they thought was extremely differently from the way that you think. And that helped you navigate social dynamics within your family after that point. with a lot more efficiency and therefore a lot more success. And so I think it's also important to realize that that can also happen for people who are not having a hard time with their family. That can also happen in their personal relationships with their partner. That can also happen in their public relationships at work or at school. So, I mean, all of these different kinds of relationships can be affected greatly by understanding and perhaps empathizing from a different perspective, one that's outside of your head rather than inside.
That sounds to me like we're talking about detachment mechanisms, right? Because when you're super, super attached to an outcome, you're going to have a different result than if if you're super, super attached to an outcome, then of course doing the thing is going to be a lot more difficult, right?
Sure.
So we're talking about installing detachment mechanisms in your brain to help ease the entry into action.
Sure. Agreed, specifically with regard to the social dynamics involved in first approaching a woman.
Yeah, I mean, you were talking about if you know the different personality types, then it might help you, empathize or understand what other people are going through when that, when that happens to them, that you start a conversation with them, right? That might be an easier way to enter if you understand what's going on maybe before you start. But I think we are also touched on a little bit of like progress, and I always say progress is a hell of a drug.
I like that.
So if you jump in first, even that's, well, I did it, and that starts the drug, right? The positive feedback cycle.
Yeah,
I like that's the thought of the day. Progress is a hell of a drug. I love that.
That goes back to any sort of an object in motion tends to stay in motion. An object sitting still tends to stay sitting still. It takes a lot more just to get that initial push than it does to
first
keep
action
it
under.
Yeah, momentum.
Get the momentum going. Exactly.
Yeah, it's like when the Patriots beat the Falcons down 28-3. I'm texting my cousin. I'm like, all we need is one break. I'm like, this is not over.
It's also worth. It's also
thing after another.
Sorry to jump in on your sports conversation. It's also worth noting that your motivation to achieve something is very closely linked with what you believe your ability is to actually achieve it. If there's $100 bill across the street and you're like, I see that, I can probably beat anybody there. Nobody's seen it yet. Then you probably go do it, right? But if something is a lot harder, you don't believe that you can do it. It's a lot harder to start in the first place, right? You have really low motivation to achieve it because you don't think that, you don't have an expectation of success.
All right. Thanks for watching. Again, if you're not entirely clear on your Myers-briggs type and you want to find out what it is, you can go to whattype.com/mytype. And if you want to hear more from Jake and check out his social media, go to whattype.com/Jake. Thank you.